Ken back with us for the final segment of our Jewish history journey. This time we'll be learning about the Roman Empire and its origins with Esav, and how our people interacted with and engaged with the origins of the Roman Empire, and all the trials and tribulations. And there's no better person to tell us about that than Ken Spiro. We've been hearing some great feedback from the last three segments. Also, wanted to thank our sponsors, Canals and Jacobs, for the great sponsorship, and Rabbi Feigenbaum, of course, for arranging everything. So thank you, Rabbi. And so without any further ado, Ken Spiro.
Thank you, Rabbi. I don't think I've ever been introduced to a car before.
Well, that's one of the things of Zoom.
I hope you're going to do the positive mitzvah of picking up bagels, lox, and cream cheese on Sunday morning. Anyway, yeah, everyone should please mute their microphones, please. This is, they say we're saving the best for last. We're saving the worst for last. It's actually probably the best class, but it's the worst relationship, us and the Roman Empire. So this is the grand finale, at least of this segment. Hopefully you'll have enjoyed history so much. I'll come back and do some more stuff with you. There's certainly a lot more topics to cover. I'm going to once again attempt to be, my host you have to enable me to share the screen. Rabbi, you got that? Can you do that?
I just did it.
Okay, great. Share screen. Okay, here we go. I'm going to try doing the advanced one this time, see if it'll work. Let's see if we can do this. Here we go. Rome versus Jerusalem. Okay, that's hopefully going to be it. And we're going to open this up. Let's give it just a second to, hopefully I'll be in there at the bottom. Where am I? Oh, I'm not at the bottom. That's weird. Usually I'm supposed to appear at the bottom of the screen. Okay, didn't want to let me do that. It's just letting it load for a second more.
Can people like it this way? Last time some people say your face being in the screen, they weren't able to.
Okay, so I'll leave myself at the top of the screen unless I reappear, and when it finishes loading, it might stick me at the bottom. I don't know. I always lean over, get out of the way. Okay, anyway, yeah, so we're doing Rome versus Israel, and I should do really called Rome versus Jerusalem, because we'll see in a quote from the Talmud that is the essence of, again, the most difficult relationship that we had with any of these ancient empires that we've looked at. Remember, we've done in the previous classes, we went through the famous vision that Daniel had of the 4 different beasts that represent 4 empires that would be the nemesis of the Jewish people at different periods of time in history. So we've gone through Babylon, Persia, Greece, the Hanukkah story, and now chronologically, and also in terms of, again, the difficulty we're dealing with Rome today, which is definitely the scariest of all these. I mean, I don't know where the artist got this image from, but that's kind of the scariest of all these animals. But when we go to the Roman Empire, we got to first look at our timeline to see where everything fits in. If you look at the timeline in the back, you could see the major events going on in Jewish history. You could see Greeks, Alexander the Great, the Maccabees. I put a few Roman events in here. But what I want to do now is overlay on that the actual Roman history in red, so you can see. So before we get into the Roman interaction with Israel, just like we did with Greece, we have to back up and go to the founding of the Roman Empire, which goes to Rome, considered itself founded in the year 753 before the Common Era. It's very interesting. The story about the founding of Rome, by the way, is the legend of Romulus and Remus. Well, before Rome was a great empire, it was a city, the legend goes, and there was a Vestal virgin. The Romans used to keep about 3 dozen women as virgins, on whose virginity the fate of the city and ultimately the empire rested on their purity. If a Vestal virgin was found not to be a virgin, she was buried alive. But the legend goes that Rhea Silvia, the Vestal virgin, is raped by the god Mars. So she gets pregnant, but remains a virgin. That sounds a little like something I've heard before. She gives birth to twins named Romulus and Remus, and the local king is jealous of their demigod status, like Hercules was part god, part human. So he has them thrown into a river. And they are rescued, not by Pharaoh's daughter, but by a she-wolf, a female wolf. who raises them. The emblem of the city of Rome, I really should include it in here, is a famous bronze you can see if you've been to Rome of a wolf suckling and two little kids underneath the wolf nursing from the wolf. They go on to found the city of Rome. Romulus actually kills Remus later. Sounds a little like the origins of Christianity if you're on that one. But Rome starts out originally as a city-state and will grow into an empire. Originally, it basically turns into a republic, which has a senate, which is an oligarchy, which will be a power elite that will run the country. I mean, that's where the US Senate gets its name from, as does the concept of republic, although it's a very different form of government. If you could see on our screen here, we have a series of wars that take place. I'm pointing out the arrow here from 264 BCE all the way through for another about 120 years is going to be a number of wars with a North African empire that no longer exists today called Carthage. And they're called the Punic Wars. And by the way, in the Second Punic War, Hannibal, the famous Carthaginian general, crosses the Alps with elephants. And by the way, almost destroys the Roman Empire, destroys Rome completely. Had he been as ruthless as the Romans were with him, there would be no Rome today and all of human history would be different. He even probably wins one of the greatest and costliest battles in human history in 216 BCE, the Battle of Cannae, when the Romans, out of desperation, will throw something like 90,000 men at Hannibal, who, in a brilliant piece of strategy, will end up slaughtering, could be up to 50,000 Roman legionnaires in one afternoon, which would, by the way, make it the greatest loss of human life in any battle in human history, including anything until today, if that's true, which is a pretty amazing story. Anyway, eventually the Romans will end up beating the Carthaginians, finally the last Punic War. The Romans will Scipio Africanus will destroy the city of Carthage and basically grind it into the ground. And then you see we're getting right over here towards right before the last half of the first century before the Common Era is when the Romans will interact with the Jewish people. Just to notice a little event in the middle, if you remember the famous movie with Kirk Douglas, the slave revolt of Spartacus in 73 BCE. But during this last period of time, which is the last century and a half before the Common Era, which corresponds to the period of the last Punic War, Rome is going through a lot of political instability. The Romans borrowed a lot from the Greeks, but they were, I would say, much more disciplined, industrious, and organized than the Greeks ever were. But they're also very aggressive in their expansionist worldview. And at this time, they're already conquering. Rome has expanded from a city-state into an empire, which is gobbling up things like Greece itself already by this point. You can see over here. The same year as the last Punic War, 146 BCE, Greece, the Greece of Alexander the Great, the Greece which had conquered Israel. This corresponds to the same time as the Maccabee story. Greece itself no longer exists as an independent country. It's now a client state of the Roman Empire. But that brings us to talking a little about Rome itself, because before we talk about our interaction with the Roman Empire and all the wars that we fight with them, we have to understand what an incredible military machine the Romans were. When Rome will emerge at this period of time as history's first real professional army in the West. Until that time, like the Greeks, if you remember, had citizen soldiers who had to equip themselves and had campaign seasons. The Romans will create legions. A Roman legion around the first century was 5,000, it was 10 cohorts of 500 men. That was a unit. And one cohort of 800 men, 9 cohorts of 500 men, one cohort of 800 men. So 5,300 Roman legionnaires with about 400 cavalry and an equal number of auxiliaries. And if you guys have seen the movie Gladiator, which has a lot of inaccuracies in it, but nonetheless, you see that these guys, you can see in the images here, these are recreations of, these are modern people dressed as Roman soldiers, but you could see how they had standard uniforms, standard equipment, very much like the American or any European army. You had ranks and levels of soldiers. Roman legionnaires were committed to the Roman army for 25 years. First, you trained very intensely, and you had years of campaigning. And then when you got older, you trained the younger guys. You weren't supposed to marry, by the way, which means, and basically you're talking about guys who were in their late teens, early 20s. They didn't finish their military service till their 40s. Then supposedly they're supposed to get married, and you got all kinds of benefits and a pension. And if you weren't a citizen already, you got citizenship when you joined. It's interesting that Roman historians describe Roman army legions on the move, and they would often camp for long periods of time, maybe even hundreds of years. Roman army units would be stationed in certain places, like the US Army's been in Germany since the end of World War II, or Japan. These around the Roman army camp was a whole camp of common law wives and prostitutes and a whole sub-economy of illegitimate children who were like hanging out with daddy, who was a Roman legionnaire. But these guys you see in Gladiator are serious, tough soldiers, seriously trained, incredible discipline. You really see the power of Western military to conquer everyone else because of the training and the discipline that the soldiers had. Romans, by the way, didn't fight with this big bronze armor. You could see that's flexible armor. They had two great weapons. I love military history, so I have to talk about this for just a couple of minutes so you appreciate who we're fighting against. They had a spear called a pilla. You could see this guy carrying it. Roman infantry would carry two of these into battle, very heavy throwing spears that were ingeniously designed, because if you throw a spear at someone, they can pick it up and throw it back at you. There was a metal and a wooden pin here that snapped, so when the spear hit the ground or hit a person or a shield, it broke in two and couldn't be reused. And the great Roman fighting weapon was the sword you see on the right, called the gladius, which was a Roman short sword used for close quarters combat, with that, of course, that big shield had a big metal like thing in the middle you could use to ram and push people with. The Romans, of course, never, the thing I disliked most in the movie Gladiator was that it just is a melee with these Germanic people in the forest. The Romans never broke ranks if they could help it. They were very, very disciplined. The first line of soldiers would fight for 2 minutes. Then the centurion would blow a whistle. He was the commander of the unit. And the first row would drop back and the next row would come forward. So imagine when you're fighting with a sword, you know, after 5-10 minutes of swinging that thing, you're getting real tired. You have fresh troops moving to the front. This was a very formidable fighting force. Never before seen anything like this. The Romans also had incredible tactics and discipline. The units were very flexible. You could see, this is my favorite Roman formation. It's called a tortoise, where the legionnaires would put their shields up. And this was defense against arrows and rocks and pretty cool stuff. And the Romans, when they would fight the Greeks, and we see it when Rome fought Greece in a number of very important battles, once they got around the Greek phalanx, remember those Greeks had the 21-foot-long spears, in a couple of battles, they literally chewed the Greeks up, like 700 Roman casualties and 20,000 Greek casualties. Because when you get behind guys with 21-foot-long spears, they can't maneuver very well. So the Romans were this unstoppable, really unstoppable fighting force. And this is giving you a sense of what we're going to come up against. And the last feature of the Romans, which is very relevant to our story, is siegecraft. The Romans were incredibly good. They took everything they borrowed from other empires, like the Greeks, who were very good at it, creating incredible weaponry. Like you could see these ballista that would shoot. There's me in the city of David where I dig. I'll be in there on Tuesday. Look at that ballista ball. That baby weighs about 17 kilo. And the Romans could hurl that thing out of something like this over 100 meters. Imagine getting hit with that. So here's from the city of David, another one that they let us keep because they have so many of them. This is a small ballista ball. This is we shot out of something like this. And this could be shot hundreds of yards and was used against fortifications. They had siege towers, battering rams. These guys knew how to do it. And these are the people that we're going to be up against. These are the people who are going to be conquering Israel. So now we got a sense of who they are. We have to go back to where we came from in our last class. Remember we talked about the Maccabee story and Mattathias, who was the guy who started the revolt in the city of Modi'in when he wouldn't sacrifice the pig to the Greek god, to Zeus. And here you can see his sons, who either most of them die in battle or are killed. But you see from Simon Maccabee, who was also poisoned later, his son John Hyrcanus will rule. This is the beginning of over 100 years of Maccabean rule in the land of Israel. It'll go from John Hyrcanus to Alexander Yanai. Alexander Yanai's wife is going to be Shlomtzion Hamalka, Queen Shlomtzion. And they will have 2 children, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Remember we talked about in the last class that the tragedy of the Maccabees was having given their lives to preserve Judaism and Jewish identity. Their descendants became, I would say, drunk with power and corrupted by power. And even look at their names, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. These are not particularly Greek names. So after about 100 years of Maccabean rule and Jewish independence in the land of Israel, which remember that struggle was a 25-year struggle, you have these last 2 descendants who are basically fighting, literally fighting each other over who is going to be in power, going all the way back to Judah Maccabee over here, Judas Maccabeus, you see him? When the beginning of the revolt against the Greeks, Judah Maccabee had made a treaty with the Romans. Rome was at that time just emerging as a major world power. Why would he make a treaty against with the Romans against the Greeks? Like we say in the Middle East, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And the people the Greeks feared the most were the Roman Empire, and rightly so. Even though it would take another 100 years for the Romans to gobble up from the time of the mid-2nd century to the time of Pompey Magnus, it'll take almost 100 years for the Romans to completely gobble up all of what was the Greek Empire. Judah, by the way, Judah never calls on the Romans to help him, but just keep that's running in the background as a relationship. During this battle between these Maccabean descendants, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, Hyrcanus has an advisor whose name is Antipater. Antipater is an Edomite. The Edomites were people who lived in the south of the country, who had moved into the southern part of the country after the destruction of the first temple, like the Samaritans had been put in the north. Their father, their grandfather, John Hyrcanus, had gone down to the Edomites when he was expanding his control of the land of Israel and told them, if you want to stay in the land, you got to convert or get out. So Hyrcanus's advisor, Antipater, was an Edomite convert to Judaism. Certainly not one who was doing it because he wanted to be Jewish, but probably because he didn't want to be expelled. One of the only examples of semi-forced conversion we know of in Jewish history. But it's like the Jews in Spain in 1492. If you want to stay in Spain, you got to become a Catholic, otherwise get out. Meanwhile, Antipater is a very wily guy. He's the guy behind the scenes who, as these two brothers are duking it out, he is using his position of power and influence to put his own children in positions of power. And one of his children we're going to see is going to be Herod, that we're going to talk about in just a minute. Meanwhile, when these two brothers are fighting it out, they will call on the Romans to mediate. And now the Romans will finally show up in the land of Israel, a little less than 100 years after the revolt against the Maccabees. So after 100 years of like basically Jewish independence, we're going to have the last period of Jewish independence in the land of Israel for 2,000 years. Ends when Pompey Magnus shows up. Remember Pompey? Remember Julius Caesar. In these last few decades before the Common Era, Rome is basically taken over. The Senate loses power, and various generals are going to fight it out for control. And if you've read the famous play of Shakespeare, we know that you have Brutus Crassus, and remember you have Mark Antony and Brutus and Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar's murdered. Mark Antony makes a speech, and Brutus is killed, and goes on and on. Everyone's killing each other out. Eventually, by the way, before Caesar is killed, he co-rules with Pompey Magnus. There's the famous story is when Caesar seizes power, he crosses the Rubicon River and basically takes over the city of Rome. Pompey flees to Egypt, where he's murdered by the Greek ruler of Egypt, thinking that Caesar will be happy with his rival being killed. And Caesar then ends up ruling, and then he is murdered, and everyone's killing each other out, not to get too lost in this narrative because it's too complicated. But before Pompey is killed, backtracking in the story, he will come to the land of Israel. You can see him marching in with the 10th Roman Legion here. I'm not sure that was actually a legion he commanded, but it looks good in the picture. And you can see his picture over there, and he will absorb. The Romans don't come to mediate anything. The Romans only come to conquer. Probably the most famous military dispatch in all of human history is Julius Caesar writing from Gaul, which is today France, 2000, probably 60, 70 years ago. It's mispronounced as Veni, Vidi, Vici, but it's said in Latin, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. So the Romans will show up in their ever-expanding empire with their legions, come to the land of Israel, conquer it, and make it basically a client state of the Roman Empire. And you can see it's a much smaller area than the Israel of today. And they will rename it Judea, after the Jews. The Romans generally liked to rule in a smart way. They end up ruling the whole Mediterranean, which is a vast area. If they had to station their own troops everywhere, that would be prohibitively expensive and very manpower intensive. So the Romans generally, when they conquered you, they made you like a client king, meaning you listen to us, you recognize we're in charge, you realize you're part of the Roman Empire, you pay your taxes, you'll be fine. And you could do a lot worse than living under the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. You got incredible stability. You got the Mediterranean as a safe place to trade on instead of pirates running around. You got Roman roads and Roman infrastructure, really. But if you rebelled, that was always bad news because the Romans could never afford to allow rebellions to break out, given that their entire army of maybe 24 legions only encompassed 250,000 men, and to rule the entire Mediterranean with that size of a force would have been very difficult if you were constantly fighting battles everywhere. And here you could see the Roman Empire pretty much at the height of its expansion. You can see how far it gets. Look, it gets all the way up to northern England to the border of Scotland with Hadrian's Wall. The height of Roman expansion in Pax Romana is 117 of the Common Era. But here you can see little Judea off over there, all of North Africa, the Mediterranean, the world's largest inland sea is now a Roman sea, and they rule the Western world. It's an incredible empire that they were able to create. But going back to our narrative, because we're going to converge the Roman history with the Jewish history now. Hyrcanus, in that story, they were talking about if Hyrcanus fighting Aristobulus with Antipater on the side, all these guys end up dead. I'm not going to go into the details. Again, there's way too much information there. But as I said, Antipater will put his children in positions of power. One of his children, the Herods, I love this, the Herods. Herod the Great, will put his son in power as governor of the Galilee. I mean, Antipater put his son Herod as governor of the Galilee initially up north, where he is very disliked. The Jews will rebel against him. He will use Roman soldiers to crush that rebellion. During the final battles that are fought between the Roman generals who are fighting it out for power and control in Rome, and the last two guys left standing in all of these characters of Julius Caesar and Brutus and Crassus and Pompey, the last two guys left standing are a guy by the name of Octavian and a guy by the name of Mark Antony. Mark Antony's girlfriend is the Egyptian Greek queen Cleopatra VII. That's like a family name. There's a lot of Cleopatras. And after the famous sea battle of Actium, which Mark Antony loses, he will commit suicide. Cleopatra will commit suicide. And Octavian will emerge finally, after decades of tumult in the Roman Empire, as the undisputed first real emperor of what's now an empire, no longer a republic. The Senate will continue to exist, but really a dictator called Caesar, which is a generic term, Caesar Augustus. In this case, he will change his name to the first great Roman emperor. That's how Rome is going to be ruled. Now, during that fighting, Herod, Antipater's son, initially is backing Mark Antony, but at the last minute, very smart move on his part, he switches sides, and he will block Cleopatra's soldiers from moving to the land of Israel. And it turns out to be a very smart move because they lose the battle, and he ends up on the winning side. He is summoned to the island of Rhodes by Octavian, soon to become Augustus. He thinks he's going to be executed, but he comes out of that meeting with Augustus, not only with his head on his shoulders, but with Augustus making him king of Israel. And he will rule from 37 to 4 BCE. And he's not a legitimate king in any stretch of the imagination. He's not a descendant from King David. His father was an Edomite, Antipater. His mother, whose name was Kypros, was a Nabatean, the famous traders of the Arabian Peninsula who built the city of Petra that maybe some of you have visited, that beautiful stone city. Actually went there once. But he will rule during basically the reign of Augustus Caesar, who will be his patron as a client king in the land of Israel, and create a dynastic line that, although few of his children will actually rule the land of Israel, they will marry all kinds of other people in the Middle East. Where do we know about Herod from? We know about him from a guy by the name of Josephus, Flavius Josephus, whose real name is Yosef ben Matityahu. who lives from the year 40 to the year 100 CE. And he's a very interesting person. If you're even a little bit serious about Jewish history, I highly recommend getting a copy of the Works of Josephus. You can see 2 copies of it here. It's basically 2 books. One is a book called Antiquities, which is the first Jewish history book ever written, which covers all of Jewish history until Herod's time, 2,000 years ago. And the second is a book called The Jewish War, which gives us all the accounts of the conflict between the Jewish people and Rome in the Great Revolt from 66 to 70 that we're going to be looking at, all the way to the story of Masada in just a couple of minutes. Herod, by the way, when you're going to read him, you got to read him really cautiously and critically, because all historians are subjective, except for me. I'm the only historian whose personal opinion never enters into anything, unless I'm talking about the United Nations and a few other international organizations. There's a joke, not even God can change history, only historians can. And classical historians are notorious for playing around with things. Now, what we know about Herod, to be correct, is the major characters, the major events, they're accurate. His physical descriptions, he has a photographic eye. Unbelievably accurate descriptions. How do we know? Because thousands of years later, we dig, and what he describes is there, and it looks exactly the way he describes it. Shmaryahu Gutman, the famous archaeologist who died many years ago, found the city of Gamla in the Golan Heights, which is called the Masada of the North. Similar story we'll talk about in a minute. By walking along the Golan Heights after the 1967 Six-Day War, and when he got to the place where what Josephus says you see from Gamla matched what he was looking at, they dug and they found the city. So that's how good his eye was. But when he describes who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's bad, how many people fought, how many people died, you got to be careful. Josephus says about himself that he, at the beginning of this great revolt that we're going to get to in a few minutes, he was in charge. He was a Cohen. He was from a priestly family from Jerusalem. He was in charge of the defense of the north of the country against the Romans. And at the city of Yotfat, when the city was about to fall to the Romans, generally defenders would generally, especially in Israel, choose to commit suicide. Remember, the whole idea of mercy in warfare and sparing non-combatants like women and children is a modern concept. It appears first in Western warfare. It is basically from the last century, really, but it's the last few centuries at most. It is a Judeo-Christian concept, meaning it comes from Judaism. In the ancient world, you did not spare anyone. You didn't take prisoners of war unless they had value, including women and children, to be raped, to be sold as slaves, to be fed to lions, to watch them kill each other in gladiatorial sports, a major feature of the Roman Empire. Very important to recognize that. So the Jews generally chose, rather than be crucified or fed to a lion or something like that, we'll just kill ourselves. Josephus, his real name is Yosef ben Matityahu, chickens out and convinces the last couple of guys to surrender to the Romans. The Romans will take him as a prisoner of war, and then they will use him, he's a smart guy, obviously, as a guide and a translator. He will actually witness the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. He will be adopted by the father-son general team that we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes, who are the Vespasian and Titus. Remember, the Romans, like a lot of Asians, have the last name first. So they're the Flavian emperors. So they all have the name Flavius, Titus, Flavius, Vespasianus, whatever. Just like you have, the guy in Korea today, that really nice guy, Kim, I call him Kim Il-jung haircut. Like his first name is haircut, but his last name is Kim. So that comes first. So he will be adopted by the Roman generals who become emperors. Adopting wasn't like we pay your college tuition, your orthodontia bills. It was a way of honoring people you liked. He'll become a close friend of these Roman generals who will become Caesars. And he will take the name Flavius Josephus. He will adopt the Roman royal family name. So when you're reading the guy, you got to read him cautiously and critically, but it's an incredible read, his stuff. And he gives us such a bird's eye view of what is going on. He tells us, now Herod had a personal biographer named Nicholas of Damascus in Syria. His writings did not survive. We do not have the original, but it's clear that Josephus, who lives after Herod's time, remember, Herod is from 37 to 4 BCE. Josephus lives from 40 CE till the year 100. He's born in Jerusalem and dies in Rome at the age of 60. But he clearly had access to biographical material about Herod. So when he's writing about him, he's getting it from this guy, Nicholas of Damascus. Herod is one of the few leaders in the ancient world who's called great. He wasn't a great conqueror, but he was a great builder. He lived at a time when Rome was at the height of his power, a lot of stability. Jerusalem and Israel had a lot of valuable cash crops that were being exported, wine and dates and olive oil. And he had major trade routes that he used, and he taxed, and he had a lot of money at his disposal. He also taxed the Jewish people brutally. And he was a very paranoid human being, and he loved luxury. And paranoid human beings who love luxury tend to build really nice, very strong, secure palaces. One of them you can see today is at Jaffa Gate, which is called David's Citadel. Has nothing to do with King David at all. The bottom segment of what you can even see today is Herodian. It's part of his palace fortress you can see over here. There was 3 towers in that palace fortress. One was named Hippicus, one was named Fatsael, and one was named Miriam. And these are the remains of the towers you can see today over here. Just the bases of them are the original Herodian towers. One was his best friend, Fatsael, one was Hippicus, his brother, and one was Miriam, the last surviving, according to Josephus, Maccabean princess. Herod, being illegitimate as a king, also made him very paranoid. When I say illegitimate, he knew that the Jewish people knew that he wasn't a descendant of King David. He had no right to be king. So if you want to get legitimacy, you marry a Jewish princess. So he marries, according to Josephus, the last surviving Maccabean female. The problem is that he is also insanely jealous of her. And look what Josephus describes happens to her. His passion also made him stark mad, and leaping out of his bed, he ran around the palace in a wild manner. By the way, his sister Salome took the opportunity to slander Miriam. His sister and mother hated her. They were very jealous of her status as a Maccabean. Her brother was Aristobulus, the high priest. Herod was very jealous of his brother-in-law because everyone loved him being a Maccabean priest. So he invited him to a pool party in his winter palace in Jericho and had him held underwater and drowned. Ooh, swimming accident. Then out of his ungovernable jealousy and rage, he commanded her to be killed immediately. But as soon as his passion was over, he repented of what he had done. And as soon as his anger had worn off, his affections were kindled again. Now he's in love with her, but she's dead. Okay. Indeed, the flame of his desire for her was so strong that he could not think she was dead, but he would appear under his disorders to speak to her as if she were still alive. And he also had her embalmed in a giant glass jar and kept her floating in the basement of that palace, of that tower he named after her. So this guy was not the guy you wanted to get on the wrong side of. Anyone he was jealous of, he had killed, including most of the rabbis of the Sanhedrin. Now, one particular rabbi who he had blinded, his name was Bava ben Buta. Look at the story in the Talmud in Bava Batra. Herod placed a garland made of porcupine hide on Bava Buta. He had these spikes put on his head so his eyes were taken out, which pricked his eyes out. One day, Herod came and sat before him without identifying himself in order to test him. He wanted to get him. I left this guy alive. I should get him to slander me. He can't see who I am. This way I can have him killed also. Herod, said, "See, master, what an evil slave Herod is doing." Bava ben Buta said to him, "What should I do to him?" Herod said to him, "The master should curse him." Bava ben Buta said to him, "But it is written, do not curse the king, not even in your thoughts." Herod said to him, "He is not a king since he rules illegally." Bava ben Buta said to him, "And even if he were merely a rich man, I would not curse him, as it is written, and do not curse a rich man in your bedchamber. And even were he only a leader, I would not curse him, as it is written, and I shall not curse him, a leader amongst your people." Interesting. So he refuses to do it, and Herod is so impressed excuse me, I don't want to go to the image quite yet. He was so impressed by Bava ben Buta's control of his mouth and his knowledge of the laws of lashon hara, of correct speech. He said, "Wow, if I had known how careful the sages were with their words, I would have honored them rather than killing them. How could I make amends?" And the Talmud goes on to explain that he says, "Well, look, the light of the Jewish people is Torah, and by killing the rabbis, you snuffed out the light. The temple is also a source of light, and the temple that we have in Jerusalem is a cheapo fixer-upper temple built by the Jews returning from the Babylonian exile that we saw, a couple classes ago. How about you fix it up?" So Herod hears build buildings, ding, ding, ding. He gets all excited. I've been saying this, by the way, for decades. It's not a political statement. I've literally been saying for 25 years. Herod is a cross between Donald Trump and Joseph Stalin. The only difference is had Trump had Trump built the second temple, would have had like these big gold letters TT on it, like the Trump temple. He loved big buildings, and the crazy dangerous side of him was the Stalin side of him. It was a very interesting combination of people, and he will go and rebuild the second temple into an incredible, beautiful building. Oh, I thought I'd move this. Okay, this image, this quote is supposed to be a little later on. I see I opened up a different version of the presentation, but we'll read it now anyway. Although I'm going to refer to it in a couple of minutes, because Herod's going to build a number of things. One of them is the city of Caesarea. We'll talk about, but it's interesting. Caesarea will become the Roman capital of Israel, and the rabbis in Tractate Megillah say the sages said that the fortress of Caesarea, which represents Rome, and Jerusalem are diametric opposites. If therefore someone says to you that both cities are destroyed, do not believe them. Similarly, if he says to you that they are both settled in tranquility, do not believe them. If, however, he says to them that Caesarea is destroyed and Jerusalem is settled, or that Jerusalem is destroyed and Caesarea is settled, believe him. What the rabbis are telling us in this statement in the Talmud is not literally, because Caesarea, at the height of its glory as an incredible city, existed at the same time as Herod's incredible, beautiful temple exists in Jerusalem that you can see. But what we're being told is this relationship between Rome and Israel is going to be an impossible relationship, that the two cannot be up at the same time. And remember, Rome in Jewish tradition comes from Edom, and Edom comes from Esav. This is our twin brother. It's not like Isaac and Ishmael, where he's our brother from another mother. We're from Sarah, he's from Hagar. This is the most intense relationship. This is real family on the deepest level, which means Esav has incredible potential, as much potential as we have, but it goes in the wrong direction. And these twins, just as in lifetime, they were diametrically different from each other, so too we're told that this is going to set up the greatest confrontation, albeit unequal in terms of physical force, because Rome is a superpower, the equivalent of NATO and the Warsaw Pact together, for those of you old enough to remember. Those, especially the Warsaw Pact, doesn't exist anymore. And are the Jewish people a much smaller country and a much weaker military force. But anyway, by the way, Herod, despite the fact that he was brutal to the rabbis and killed so many of them, he was still an incredible builder. And to his credit, the rabbis, the Talmud and Bava Batra say, the sages say, one who has not seen Herod's building has never seen a beautiful building in his life. When he finishes building the second temple, he had built the largest temple site on the planet Earth. The platform that it sits on, which is still existent today, is the largest platform ever built anywhere on the planet Earth. A trapezoid 500 meters by 300 meters that you can stick 30 football fields on. An incredible building that they think 1 million non-Jewish tourists would come to see 2,000 years ago. So you see how crazy this guy is on one hand, how dangerous he is, but how he just loved luxury and he loved to build. And like you can see, some of the things he built are blow archaeologists out of the water, and how cool they are and how complicated they were to make, including, of course, the city of Caesarea Maritima, which was an artificial port because Jerusalem lacks a deep water port. Jaffa is a shallow port. He makes a 400-meter jetty going out using volcanic lava put in wood frames underwater, hardened into solid blocks underwater. The Romans figured that out. This is an artificial port feature with a huge lighthouse, with an incredible palace that extended. It's actually not in the picture here, the palace, but he had a palace that extended into the Mediterranean, a temple to Augustus Caesar, and of course, his other really famous piece of construction is Masada, which is this amazing palace fortress built on the top of a mountain. From the top here to the bottom, by the ground level, by the Dead Sea, is the equivalent of street level in Manhattan to the observation deck of the Empire State Building. And this fortress especially is going to play a big role in the Great Revolt that we're going to talk about now, because this is where the revolt is going to start in 66, and this is where the revolt is going to end in the year 73. He also built an incredible mountain fortress, artificial mountain called Herodium, right outside Jerusalem. This is what remains of it today. In its day, it had a castle on top of it. This is Ehud Netzer, who dug with Yigal Yadin in the 60s in Masada, which was the biggest national excavation project in Israel's history. This guy, Ehud Netzer, was obsessed with Herod and spent every minute from the 60s till the mid 2015 looking for Herod's burial spot, because Josephus says that Herod died in Jericho of some horrible disease, and they brought his body to Herodium and buried it there, yet they never found the tomb. And finally, in 2015, here's Ehud Netzer standing by what he thinks is the smashed sarcophagus, the bone box that Herod was buried in. And they've rebuilt this now. This is the whole tomb site reconstructed on the side of the hill over here where they think he was buried. The tragedy is, of course, Ehud Netzer, who spent his whole life looking for Herod's tomb, in 2015 was up above the site, leaned on a railing, the railing snapped, and he fell to his death at Herod's tomb. I think he tragically was in his 70s. The Arab, by the way, the archaeologists say, no, the Arabs bumped him off. They hated him and they unscrewed the railing. They knew he always leaned on it. They unscrewed the screws because they knew he'd lean on it and he fell through it. Who knows? But I think if you could have asked Ehud Netzer, he probably would have said he would have liked to have lived another decade or so more, but he would have no better place to have gone than by next to the guy he spent his whole life studying and looking for his tomb site. But guys, it's also during this period of time, just to focus on what's going on in the Jewish world, kingship might be missing and priesthood might be corrupted, but we're in a period of time through Herod called the Zugot, which are 5 pairs of rabbis who will be, one will be the Av Beit Din, the head of the court, and one will, remember that 71 judges who will hold the Jewish people together during this period of time. Priesthood is going to be corrupted, although the temple will still function. Kingship is not going to exist in its proper form at all, but the rabbis will be holding the Jewish people together. And if you read the Ethics of the Fathers, you will see all these names appear at the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, the Av Beit Din and the Nasi. By the time you get to Hillel and Shammai, the most famous of all of them, these will be the 2 guys who run the Sanhedrin at the time of Herod the Great. Hillel who's the Nasi, the prince of the Sanhedrin, is a direct descendant of King David, will come from Babylon. And remember we talked about the Reish Galusa during the time of the Persian and Babylonian empires, the descendant of King David's family. This will be the equivalent. This will be a way of preserving the royal bloodline of King David through a rabbi who's a direct descendant of King David's family. So, but when you understand what's going on politically at this time, all the tumult, the external threats, the schisms that are taking place in the Jewish world, all the things that are happening, then what they say in the Ethics of the Fathers makes a lot more sense, the context. And in addition to that, what's going to happen is because we're getting further from Mount Sinai, because there's so much external pressure, because we're fraying at our edges and things are much more difficult politically and economically and spiritually, the whole clarity of the chain of transmission of the Jewish people is going to be weakened. Remember, guys, before this period of time, today we have all different, we have Ashkenazim and Sfardim and Hasidim and Misnagdim. I'm not talking about Reform and Conservative and stuff like that. I'm talking about even amongst the Orthodox world, there's so many different opinions, how many hours you wait between milk and meat and blah, 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 blah. When the Sanhedrin existed, before a certain period of time, you had discussions, but you went according to the majority, and all Jews held by one opinion. Can you imagine that? But look what happens. It says in the Talmud and Sanhedrin, this is taking place right at this time of Herod and what comes after. And this is during the Roman occupation with all the problems we're dealing with. It says from the time that the disciples of Shammai and Hillel grew in number, and they were disciples who did not attend to their masters to the requisite degree. I mean, they weren't on the same level anymore. Disputes proliferated amongst the Jewish people, and the Torah became like 2 Torahs. 2 disparate systems of halacha developed, and there was no longer halachic consensus with regard to every matter. And that's what we have until today, which means in the future, please God, the Messiah comes and the Sanhedrin is reconstituted. Then we'll still have these rabbis discussing, but in the end, they'll go by the majority opinion, and that will be halacha, the Jewish law for all the Jewish people. So now you know where all of this stuff comes from, all these different customs, and it's all a byproduct of what begins here and only gets worse as we get scattered around the world. But meanwhile, back to Herod, because we got to get to the great debate here. The great revolt here. That's what we're waiting for. We see that rulers, when Herod dies, he will put his son in 4 BCE, Herod Archelaus. Remember, they're all named Herod. You see, that's the family name. Herod Archelaus will rule after him. He is so corrupt and so brutal. The Romans are afraid he's going to trigger revolt in Israel, so they remove him and go back to what is direct Roman rule. And the Romans ruled Israel through what are called prefects or procurators. And there'll be a series of these procurators over this period of time who will generally be around for about 2 to 4 years. And they will always be high-ranking Roman officials, upper class people. Unfortunately, because they are pagans and very different from the Jews and have no sympathy for the Jews and often provoke the Jews, they will do a very poor job of ruling in Israel. And it'll constantly be tension between the non-Jews living in the land of Israel. The city of Caesarea is the heart of that tension. Corrupt Roman rulers, because these guys also, their job was to basically, I'm supposed to be ruling you guys in Judah, but I need to extort as much money as I can out of you so I can retire to Roman luxury. So a combination of corrupt Roman leadership, rulership on the ground in the land of Israel, combined with schism within the Jewish people, everything is going to reach this boiling point. Herod is going to have two more descendants, his grandson, Herod Agrippas I, who will rule for 3 years in the land of Israel, who's a very righteous guy, very loyal Jew, who the Jewish people like. He was raised as a hostage in Rome. One of the ways the Romans kept their client states in line was they would take the son of the king and take him to Rome. They wouldn't keep him in prison. They would treat him really well. He would grow up with Caesar's children. Herod Agrippas I, before he was Herod Agrippas I, grew up with Caligula and Claudius, later two Roman emperors. Caligula was a nutcase. He married his sister and made his horse a senator. But that's really good, because when you come back to your home country and your king, and now your friend who you grew up with as your playmate is now the emperor of Rome, it puts you in a great position. He used his influence in his relationship with Rome to do good things for the Jewish people. There's a famous story in the Talmud when he would read every 7 years after Sukkot, the king of Israel. It's called Hakel. It's a mitzvah that's done after the sabbatical year in the land of Israel. They put a big stage up on the Temple Mount, and the king would read from the book of Deuteronomy. Today, it's done in the state of Israel after the Shemitah year, after the sabbatical year, by the president of Israel in the Western Wall Plaza. They reenact the whole event. But the story goes in the Talmud that Agrippas is reading from the Torah after the sabbatical year, and he's crying because he gets to the part in Deuteronomy where it says a stranger will not be king over you, and he knows he's not a legitimate king. And the Jewish people, he's crying, and the Jewish people, yell out to him, "No, we love you. You're a good guy." And of course, what happens to him? He gets murdered. So he's the last decent ruler of any sort in the Second Temple period. Herod's great-grandson, Herod Agrippas II, is not even a king. He's just an ethnarch. He will rule part of the land of Israel. But guys, let's fast forward and talk about the revolt for just a few minutes, because that's the climax of our story. And we're going to go a little past it to actually the Bar Kokhba revolt. But the background to the revolt is, again, direct Roman rulership in the land of Israel. Herod Agrippas II is the ethnarch, but he has very little real power in the land of Israel. The Romans are ruling directly. They're stationing significant Roman military presence in Jerusalem. There's constant tension between the Roman procurators in the land of Israel, constant provocations. Also within Israel itself, there's incredible split. The rabbis are the Sanhedrin is trying to keep the Jewish people together, but there's all kinds of splinter groups that are breaking away. You already have the Sadducees, this group of Jews who are basically, a lot of the priests, the high priest was Sadducee priests, who did not recognize the rabbi's authority, did not recognize the oral law. You had some Jews who no doubt were basically Hellenized, Greek Romanized, and not into Judaism at all. But you also had a lot of extremist groups that Josephus talks about. We generally call them zealots. When you read the Masada story, you'll hear about the zealots. But the two big groups that are mentioned that had their own leadership one was called the Sicarii. Sicarii is an Aramaic word. Remember, the language of the Second Temple period is the language of Babylon, which is Aramaic, which is the Hebrew script we use today, is Aramaic script. It's a Western Semitic language similar to Hebrew that the Talmud is written in, and we say Kaddish in Yiskadal v'Yiskadash Shmei Rabbah. It's Aramaic. Sicarii is the Aramaic word for a little dagger. The Sicarii were right-wing religious extremists who would carry these little daggers around and like come up to their opponents in the marketplace and like stab them a bunch of times and run off after assassinating them. The Brionim Josephus describes as basically a bunch of guys who were lawless bandits who were running around. So even though the Romans are in control, there's a lot of internal and external big problems going on. And these will reach a boiling point in the last couple of decades before the Great Revolt. By the way, one of the only people in the Jesus narrative We don't even know if he exists. There's no evidence that he really existed historically. That's a great class I do. But one of the few people in the narrative that we have proof he existed, because we found an inscription with his name in the city of Caesarea, is Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. And you can see how it describes here that Pilate, who had sent a procurator to Judea by Tiberius, who'd been sent as a procurator by Tiberius, this is after Augustus Caesar, sent images of Caesar called standards. The Romans had these Roman army standards into Jerusalem by night. Remember, any images or idols the Jews would have viewed as idolatry. This aroused a very great tumult amongst the Jews when day broke. For those who were near them were astonished at the sight of images and as an indication that their laws were trampled underfoot. For those laws do not permit any sort of images to be brought into the city. After this, he caused another disturbance by expending the sacred treasure, which is called the Korban. They basically stole the temple funds. So this is what's going on for these last couple of decades. There's constant provocations where the Jews threatening to revolt or saying, well, you can slit our throats before we let any images or Roman eagles be put on the Temple Mount. After this, Gaius Caesar, who represents himself as a god, sent Pretonius, the governor of Syria, with an army to Jerusalem to place the statue in the temple and commanded that in case the Jews would not admit him, he should kill the opposition and carry all the rest of the nation away into captivity. It didn't happen, but it shows you what's going on. Very stupid policy. And even though the rabbis have a different take than Josephus, remember Josephus, even though he's born and dies a Jew, he still has a lot of loyalty to the Romans who adopt him. They both agree that it was corruption, it was internal fighting within the Jewish people, and the corruption and bad policy of the local Roman leadership that's going to trigger eventually the revolt in 66, which reaches a boiling point in the city of Caesarea when Florus, the Roman procurator, gets the Romans to strip the Jewish citizens of Caesarea of their citizenship and their rights. And then they provoke the Jews in the city by sacrificing an animal outside a synagogue. It's interesting that there were synagogues. We only thought synagogues came after the temple was destroyed, but we now know that synagogues, which were used as places for study, a Beit Knesset and a Beit Midrash, exist at the same time as the second temple still standing. So these Romans, these pagans will slaughter like an animal outside the Beit Knesset to provoke the Jews, which will trigger a riot, which the Romans will crush and slaughter the Jews in Caesarea, which was the Roman capital of the land of Israel, like we saw before. Florus called out aloud to the soldiers to plunder. This is what's happening in Jerusalem now, because the Jews in Jerusalem get word of this, and they start to riot, which was called the upper marketplace, and so slay those that encountered. So the soldiers, taking this exhortation of their commander in a sense agreeable to their greed, did not only plunder the place they were sent to, but forcing themselves into every house, they slew its inhabitants. So the citizens fled along the narrow lanes, and the soldiers slew those that were caught, and no method of plunder was omitted. They also caught many of the quiet people and brought them before Florus, who first whipped and then crucified them. Remember, Jesus does not have a monopoly on crucifixion. It was the standard Roman punishment for rebellion, which, by the way, was death through suffocation, because when you're hanging there, not by his hands, but nails put through the two bones of your wrist, to lift yourself up, you have to lift yourself up to breathe. And it was a horrible way of killing people slowly, and they basically suffocated and died. So you could see this is the event, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Meanwhile, zealots will break into the garrison at Masada, overpower the Roman soldiers there, take the weapons, bring them to Jerusalem, attack the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. The Roman garrison will flee the city towards the coast. The Jews will ambush them and slaughter them. Now, the Jews think they've won a huge battle here, which is, of course, not true at all. They just destroyed the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, this is going to be the official triggering of this great revolt. Vespasian, the Roman general, who's not emperor yet, will come from, the way to become an emperor was to win battles. That's how you did it. Will come from Rome and meet up with his son Titus, who is in Syria. 4 Roman legions, about 45,000 men, will start in the year 66, working their way down from the north. One of the first places they take will be Gamla, which we call the Masada of the North, as I mentioned before, where 10,000 Jews in the city, according to Josephus, half of them will die fighting the Romans. Gamla is the best preserved Roman battle scene on the planet Earth today, exactly how it was destroyed by the Romans, you can see. And the remaining 5,000 will throw themselves off the cliff on the other side of the city rather than surrender to the Romans. They'll work their way down to Jerusalem, coming to the city. By the way, some cities did not fight. If you opened the gates up to the Romans, they let you in, you let them in. That was it, peaceful. But if you rebelled and decided to fight the Romans, they would besiege your city, breach the walls, slaughter everyone. The only people spared were people to be crucified or taken as slaves or prisoners. They would just level the city to the ground, cut down all the trees around the city, and put salt in the earth so nothing would grow. Rome was here. And of course, the prize was, of course, Jerusalem, the political and spiritual capital of the Jewish people, which, by the way, at the time, if you look on the map here, here's the old city of today. This is actually is about half the size of the old city going back to the time of the Great Revolt, which was twice the size of the city of today, getting all the way up to the Russian compound and all the way down to the city of David. So it was the largest city in the Eastern Roman Empire. The elders, the wealthy men of the city, had stockpiled massive amount of food in the city. The walls of the city were hugely fortified. The Jews were incredibly crazy fighters. Jews at this period of time were like Japanese in World War II in the Pacific. They fought to the death like crazy, and they never surrendered. Josephus describes how crazy they were and how they drove the Romans back multiple times from the walls. So the Romans will arrive on the eve of Passover. Look, we're in the first of Nisan today. 2 weeks from today is when the Romans arrive in the city, Jerusalem. They will immediately build a massive siege wall around the whole city to make sure no one escapes. Meanwhile, inside the city itself, the Jews are fighting a civil war over who's going to be in charge. 3 zealot leaders, Yochanan Gush Chalav, Shimon Bar Giora, and Eliezer ben Yair, are fighting. Can you imagine the stupidity of this? Your enemies are trying to kill you, and you're inside fighting a civil war. This is the Jewish people. In the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, fast forward to the eve of Passover of 1943, when the Germans are finally liquidating the ghetto, the mainstream Zionist organization, which is the Labor Party of today, refused to fight with the revisionist Zionists. We're not going to unite with you and fight together. No, you go fight them somewhere else. This is the insanity of the Jewish people and we're going to get to this at the end, of the real cause of the destruction. So bad was the idiocy going on inside the walls of the city that the zealots burned the food supplies inside the city, set the storehouses on fire. Because if we have too much food, the people will just sit inside the walls and try and outlast the Romans who are outside the walls. But if we burn all the food and they're starving to death, they'll be desperate and they'll try and break out. Which means major famine, just like in the destruction of much shorter siege, but just like in the destruction of the first temple, massive famine breaks out. Anyone who tried to surrender to the Romans would be killed by the zealots. It's during this time that Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the leaders of Sanhedrin, gets himself smuggled out and posing as a dead body. He stands before the Roman Emperor Vespasian, and he greets him as emperor. And Vespasian says, "I'm not emperor. I should kill you for calling me emperor." And Yochanan ben Zakkai says to him, "Well, if you're not emperor now, you're going to be emperor later, because God would only hand over his holy city to an emperor." And just then it says a messenger arrives and says, "Nero, who's the emperor, is dead, and you're going to be the emperor." It means you're going to have to go fight to be the emperor. So Vespasian leaves with his army, and he leaves his son Titus to finish the siege, but he grants Yochanan ben Zakkai 3 wishes. And this is one of the critical moments in Jewish history where one person with a lot of foresight, asks for something that's going to save the Jewish people. He asks for 3 things. He asks for doctors to spare this very righteous rabbi who was ill because he'd been fasting. He asks to spare the family of Hillel. That's the family of King David. But the most important thing he asks for, he says, "Ten li Yavna v'chachamea." Give me the city of Yavna and its sages. Allow the Sanhedrin to be reconstituted somewhere else in the land of Israel, because we can survive without everything. We can survive. We talked about this before. We can survive without temple. We can survive without temple service. We can survive. The only thing we can't survive without is the Torah. And the Sanhedrin's job, I'm not talking about the written Torah, I'm talking about the oral law. If the Sanhedrin can survive and transmit and pass on and interpret and adapt and apply the oral law, the Jewish people will survive. And his wishes are granted. Meanwhile, the Romans will breach the walls of the city one by one. There's a series of walls. There's the outer wall starting in the north. You can see, by the way, when they go into the Pilgrim's Road, which they're excavating now, which is the most expensive archaeological excavation in the world. It's a $250 million excavation because they have to support the streets above it. You can see my ballista stone here. There's my ballista stone. Look, there's a guy holding them. They found the major Pilgrim's Road within the city, with coins from the Great Revolt lying on the street, ballista stones lying everywhere, direct evidence of the siege and destruction of the city. The Romans will basically fight their way onto the northern side of the Temple Mount, which itself was a massive fortification. They try and make their way through the Antonia fortress. There was a huge fortress that had been built by Herod to control the Temple Mount, but the Zealots will push them back through. They will level the entire northern wall of the city, of the Temple Mount, and then march their legions in, and a huge battle will break out of the Jews desperately trying to keep the Romans away from the temple. And you can see this is the Roman historian Dio Cassius describing the fighting. This is a Roman perspective on the fighting. Dio Cassius, by the way, lived after the combat took place. He said, while the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. Nor was there consideration of any age, but children and old men and priests were all slain in the same manner. The flames also carried a long way and made an echo, together with the groans of those who were slain. One would have thought that the whole city would have been on fire, nor can one imagine anything greater and more terrible than this noise. And what date is this taking place on? This is taking place in August of the year 70, the 9th of Av. The 9th of the month of Av, the same date that the first temple was destroyed on, the same date that the spies came back from badmouthing the land of Israel, that Moses sent in 10 of the 12 spies and said, we can't conquer the land. And God said, you're crying on this day for no good reason. I'll give you what to cry about. And this is the second tragic event, the Roman destruction of the city of Jerusalem in the year 70. By the way, it takes another month to conquer the rest of the upper city. And again, you see the clear evidence of destruction everywhere. Josephus describes how Jews fled into the storm drains under the city, just like when the Warsaw Ghetto fell. Jews fled into the sewers, and the Romans pursued them down there, ripping up the streets. You can see right here, this is part of the street. It's really cool because every few feet you can see where over here, the Romans have ripped up the street looking for Jews hiding in the sewers, just as Josephus describes it. They found coins in the revolt. They found Roman short sword lying in the sewers. It's an incredible story. In the Jewish quarter of today, you can also see clear evidence of the destruction of the city. There's a beautiful villa in the heart of the Jewish quarter, probably a priestly home. You can see the beams of the roof lying on the floor charred, and the burns on the walls across the street. In a place called the Burnt House that some of you may have been to. They even found a spear and a woman's arm lying on the floor, cut off by a Roman soldier. It's unbelievable stuff. This is right underneath where I'm sitting today in the Jewish quarter. So you have all of this stuff there. And in the southern part of the excavations, you also see the exact same thing. A street where the Romans leveled the temple and pushed the upper part of the platform into the valley below. And these are the stones as they hit the street, damaging the street going back 2,000 years ago. The most graphic evidence of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem is right there, that you can see today. 3 years later, it's going to go a couple minutes over, just a couple minutes over, because we've got to talk about a few more things and get to the end of our talk. The last outpost of Jewish resistance will be Masada, where one of the zealot leaders, whose name is Eliezer ben Yair, will flee to, and about 1,000 Jews will be camped out at the top of Masada, a seemingly impregnable fortress. The Romans, when they conquer Jerusalem, will capture the other two leaders alive, Yochanan Gush Chalav and Shimon Bar Giora. They will be brought back to Rome and marched in a triumphant parade through the city. You could see this on the site of Titus's Arch in Rome, the famous arch built by Diocletian 10 years after Titus was emperor, showing the victory parade, which was called the Triumph. At the end of the parade, Shimon Bar Giora was ritually strangled, and Yochanan Gush Chalav spent the rest of his days rotting in the Palatine prison in Rome, where you could still see his name on a plaque when you visit the Forum in Rome today. But the last leader, Eliezer ben Yair, fled to Masada, which holds out for 3 years. 3 years later, the Romans decided we can't have any pockets of resistance left, even in the middle of nowhere. So Flavius Silva, the commander of the 10th Roman Legion, will march down, besiege Masada. You can see using a natural rock outcropping. He'll build a siege ramp. It will take him like 3 months. An incredible feat of siegecraft. Finally, breaching the walls of the city. But the zealots, we know in the famous narrative as described by Josephus, will choose, we're not sure if it really happened or not. Again, Josephus is back in Rome at the time, but those zealots will choose to commit suicide. And when the Romans finally take the city, they will find everyone lying dead. And the only thing left all the valuables will be destroyed, and the food will be left intact to show that the defenders chose death at their own hands through mass suicide, as opposed to being slaughtered or crucified or taken as slaves by the Romans. After that period of time, there's going to be two more revolts. We're just going to touch on briefly for a minute, but this is the end of our story. One will be and I think I have a feeling some of my images are going to be missing because we're looking at the wrong version of this. But anyway, we're over time, so it's not the end of the world. In 114 to 115, there will be a massive revolt throughout the Roman Empire called Kitos's War, which will be triggered by the Persian invasion of the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Jews are so happy the Persians should destroy the Roman Empire, please, and liberate Jerusalem. Unfortunately, that does not succeed, and massive number of Jewish communities will be destroyed by the Romans, including the Jewish community of Alexandria in Egypt, which was 1/3 Jewish, the island of Cyprus. All of North African Jewish communities will be slaughtered. It's an incredible number of Jews will be killed, but the final great revolt will be from 132 to 135, triggered by, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, triggered by a Roman attempt to probably ban Judaism, like in the time of Hanukkah, and a Roman attempt to build a temple to Jupiter on the site of where the destroyed Jewish temple had stood. And you can see this is actually the bust of Hadrian that sits in the Israel Museum today. This revolt, unlike the previous revolt, will be led by a man by the name of Shimon Bar Koziva, who we know as Bar Kokhba. Unlike the revolt of 66 to 70, this will be a revolt that the Jewish people will all rally around one man. He will create a massive army of probably 100,000 Jews. They will expel the Romans from the land of Israel and declare independence. This is the first time it ever happened in the history of the Roman Empire that the Romans were expelled from any part of their empire. This was a huge threat to Rome. The Romans will send one of their best generals in, Julius Severus, to try and crush the revolt. Initially, he will not only not be successful, the Romans will actually be afraid to meet the Jews in open battle, which is very unusual. As a matter of fact, the entire 22nd Roman Legion will be wiped out and never reconstituted again. But eventually, however, the Romans will push the Jews back, and it'll end up being a guerrilla warfare where by the end of this conflict, the Jews will be hiding in caves, which the Romans will hunt them down. You can see Dio Cassius describes the battle. It says, Severus did not venture to attack his opponents in the open at any point in view of their numbers and their desperation, but by intercepting small groups, thanks to the number of soldiers and his officers, and by depriving them of food and shutting them up, he was able, rather slowly to be sure, but with comparatively little danger, to crush, exhume, exterminate them. Very few of them, in fact, survived. 50 of their most important outposts. And he goes on and on to describe like 580,000 people were killed and how many places were destroyed. Thus, nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate as a result of which the people had a forewarning before the war. For the tomb of Solomon, he goes on about these omens that everyone saw that supposedly were foretelling the complete destruction of the land of Israel. But guys, by the time we get to the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, probably 2/3 of the Jews in the world had been killed between the year 66 and the year 135, which would mean that not numerically, but percentage-wise, more Jews, in my opinion, died than Hitler killed in the Holocaust. I think that 2/3 of the Jews in the world were wiped out. Judea was completely destroyed. The Romans even attempted to completely obliterate Torah in the land of Israel. They will basically wipe the rabbis out completely. As a matter of fact, there's a famous story in the Tractate Sanhedrin, which describes that Yehuda ben Bava, one of the last surviving rabbis, he went and sat between, it describes how he went in completely neutral territory so the Romans could not take revenge on any city because they'd outlawed the teaching of Torah. And he gives smicha, he ordains the last 5 properly ordained rabbis in all of Jewish history. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Shemua. He goes to all the different rabbis who he gave rabbinic ordination to secretly in the woods because the Romans were hunting down and trying to kill all the rabbis. Meanwhile, they hear the Romans, it says, when their enemies discovered them, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said to the, the typo there, said to the newly ordained sages, my sons, run for your lives. They said to my teacher, what will be with you? Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava was elderly and unable to run. He said to them, in any case, I am a cast before before them like a stone that cannot be overturned. Even if you attempt to assist me, I will not be able to escape due to my frailty. But if you do not escape without me, you will also be killed. People say about this incident, the Roman soldiers did not move from there until they had inserted 300 iron spears into him, making him appear like a sieve pierced with many holes. He martyred himself, like, I'm going to hold the Romans off, or you go hide. And because of this one guy, literally the oral Torah survived. And it's because of this story in history that we still are around today as Jews. And it talks about the destruction was so intense. The final city to fall was the city of Beitar. And when it fell, Shimon bar Kochva, the leader of the revolt, also died. And the Romans will obliterate the city and kill everyone. It talks about, there's a story about how the blood ran down to the Mediterranean and how the destruction was unimaginably bad. The Romans will rename every city in the land of Israel non-Jewish names to cut us off. They will rename the whole country after the extinct Philistines, Palestina, which is where the name Palestinians comes from today, although the modern Arabs who call themselves Palestinians have nothing to do with the ancient Philistines, nor with this period of time. By the way, the only people who called themselves Palestinians before 1948 were the Jews living in Israel before they became Israelis. They'll rename Jerusalem after Hadrian, Aelia Capitolina, build a temple to Jupiter on the site of the Temple Mount, and ban Jews on punishment of death from entering the city. They'll rename all the cities in the land of Israel non-Jewish names. The city of Shechem, where Joseph is named, will become renamed Naples. Arabs can't pronounce P's, so they call it Nablus today. The only time Jews were allowed in Jerusalem was on the 9th of Av, when the Romans would let them in to see the remains of their ruined temple and rub their noses in the fact that their home country had been destroyed and their holy city was sitting in ruins. It was an incredible decimation. And you can see as we go through the timeline here, the Great Revolt of 66 to 70, Kitos's War, Bar Kokhba Revolt, and the Romans will continue to rule the land of Israel, eventually becoming Roman Christian, but that's way beyond our time frame now, which we're not going to get to since we have gone way over time. I just want to close with a little bit of food for thought, because I mentioned previously that we Jews have to recognize that although there's geopolitical realities that we have to deal with seriously, that whatever happens to us, we're in a contractual relationship with the creator of the universe. And when enemies come against us, be it 2,000 years ago or yesterday or today, it's always has something to do with our relationship we have with each other or with the creator of the universe. And the Talmud in Tractate Yuma, when talking about this, says, however, considering, it says that the first temple was destroyed. We mentioned this before in a previous class, because the Jews violated the 3 cardinal sins of Gilui Ra'ah, Shfichas Damim, and Avodah Zorah, of illicit sexual relations, idolatry, and murder. It doesn't mean all the Jews were doing those things, but enough Jews were doing it, and the rest of the Jews weren't making them stop and taking responsibility for them, that it led to us going into overdraft in our relationship with God and our spiritual bank account, and he expels us from our country and destroys the temple. The same page of the Tractate Yuma in the Talmud says, however, considering that the people during the Second Temple period were engaged in Torah observance, observed the mitzvahs and acts of kindness, and that they did not perform the sinful acts that were performed in the first temple, why was the Second Temple destroyed? It was destroyed due to the fact that there was wanton hatred during this period. Sinat chinam, causeless hatred of one Jew for another, which is what we saw in our narrative, with Jews fighting a civil war as the Romans are trying to kill us. Okay, so due to the wanton hatred in this period, this comes to teach us that the sin of wanton hatred is equivalent to the 3 severe transgressions: idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. So guys, like I said, the story comes to an end. We lose our homeland for 2,000 years. The Romans, there's Titus's victory arch, you can see, built by his brother Diocletian after he died. Here's the scene of the triumphant parade. There's the Roman Forum with the Colosseum. You could even see them carrying the menorah as booty after the destruction. The menorah that sits in the Jewish quarter today, full size, ready to be used should the temple be rebuilt, with 40 kilograms of gold on it, is an exact copy of this image you see over here. But guys, if you think what happened, we're going to skip through that over here. Like I said in my t-shirt that I think I showed you before, we went through a lot of empires, and they've come, they've gone. Today, the Roman Empire sits in ruins. The Italians, although genetically many of the Italian people are descended from the Romans, the Roman Empire is gone, as is the ancient Greek Empire, as the ancient Persian Empire, as is the Babylonian Empire. We saw them all and beat them all, as Mark Twain said. So we got to remember that God runs the world and we're going to always outlast them. But we have to take to heart the most important lesson from this whole period of time, that we still live in the diaspora caused by the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. It might be a very comfortable diaspora in Jacksonville or in Brooklyn, and even living in the land of Israel today with Jerusalem rebuilt, but we do not have all the Jewish people back in the land of Israel. We do not have a temple rebuilt. And we have to recognize that the same causeless hatred that caused the destruction of the Second Temple on the deepest level still plagues us today. We have millions of people in this world are anti-Semites who hate us, who want us dead, who want to destroy the Jewish state. Yet rather than focusing on what unites us, we're still focusing on what separates us. And we should not have to. And one of the great lessons of external threats is often that's what it takes to get us to put our differences aside and focus on what unites us. And let's remember that we have a lot in common as a people, and we have to make a paradigm shift. If we want to end the threats against us and have a unified Jewish people, we need to start on a personal, individual level, recognizing that we may not agree with each other, but we're brothers and sisters. We have a unique homeland that we all share, a unique body of wisdom, and a unique historical mission that we all have in common. And if we can start to focus on our fellow Jews as brothers and sisters who share those common things, and recognize that we have to put our efforts into making this beautiful vision that we brought into the world thousands of years ago a reality, that's when the nations of the world will stop persecuting us, and not only stop persecuting us, but line up behind us. And that's when we get to the end of this story. We had 2,000 years of exile, but we've come back. The fact that we're back in the land of Israel today, it's truly supernatural. And we're just missing that final, like getting to that tipping point of that Jewish unity and proactivity. So then we get to the third temple, and then we get Jerusalem truly rebuilt. And all of you make an aliyah from Jacksonville, wherever else you are, back to the land of Israel, back to where we're supposed to be, and a very happy ending to this incredible long story. Guys, we went way over time. I apologize. That was way too much material to cover. I see in a 1 hour class, it's actually 2 classes. And as is, I ran through it, but I thank you for being with me on this. You're welcome to visit my website. Hopefully I will be back. I'll be happy to take some questions now. Absolutely. If you want to ask me anything, or you can contact me through the website if you want to send any feedback or ask me questions directly through the website. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and be happy to take any questions anyone has.
Everybody, please give a big round of applause to Ken. We really enjoyed these last 4 classes, 2 in February and 2 in March, ending with the Roman exile. And really, it was unbelievable and fascinating, the information that you had. And you're right, so much information to put in 1 hour. Very impressive. Guys, just a quick reminder that there is a Lunch to Learn tomorrow in person in the JCA. Please RSVP at 12:30 and on Zoom. So please join us for that. And a very big thank you to Ken and Alice and Jacob for sponsoring all our Winter Wisdom, all the great programs that we had in classes. So please stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have one more before Pesach. Still trying to put it together. If not, we'll have it right after Pesach. But please stay tuned to that. And now, if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and ask Ken.
Jews with no questions. How unusual.
Guys, go ahead.
Wonderful series. Thank you so much.
Oh, I like that t-shirt. Thank you. Thanks.
You signed it. This is actually signed by Rabbi Spiro.
All right. I remember that.
When my wife